Giza, last resting place of three of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history. A wonder of the world. And home to a mystery. In a temple connected to the pyramid of the Pharaoh Khafre, archaeologists discovered a huge and perfectly preserved statue of the king, carved in an exotic iridescent stone. But this sculpture is in no local rock. In fact, this striking material can only be found deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from Giza. So how did Khafre's people manage to bring this marvel here, 4,000 years ago? To investigate this puzzle, Egypt detectives, archaeologist Miriam Cooke and Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat search out the lost quarries of Khafre and undertake a unique experiment in ancient Egyptian engineering. The statue stares out at us across 4 millennia, a silent monument to the achievements of a lost civilization. It still inspires awe in those who come under its gaze, none more so than Egyptian antiquities chief Zahi Hawass.
Is one of the most beautiful statues ever made by a sculptor. It's really unique. I always say that he looks like a king because the sculptor put the royal blood in the statue, that you can feel that he's a king. When I look at the profile of that statue, I can really feel that the hawk is taking the king and flying with him up to the sky.
Made for a living god, the presence of this statue at Giza is also something of a miracle. It was carved from a single 3-ton block of gneiss, a rare stone not found anywhere close to the pyramid site. The question for the detectives is, where did this huge stone originally come from? And how did the Egyptians, with no modern technology, manage to get it here? The logical place to begin seems to be the valley temple where the statue was found. This is in itself an incredible feat of engineering. It is constructed of massive blocks of red granite, which, like the statue, also must have been carried great distances, as this rock isn't found locally. Perhaps finding the source of this could provide the first clue to the statue's origin. The detectives decide to split up. Dominic's expertise is best put to use researching ancient Egyptian technology. Miriam, meanwhile, heads south, down the Nile, to meet the archaeological team who are working on the puzzle of Khafre's quarries. Aswan, the southern edge of ancient Egypt. This has been identified as where Khafre found the massive red granite blocks to build his valley temple. Although Aswan is hundreds of miles from Giza, quarrying here was possible thanks to the Nile. When the blocks of stone had been cut from the cliffs and roughly shaped on site, they only had to be moved a short distance to the river, where they could be loaded onto barges, letting the water do the work of carrying them north to the pharaoh's court. Without the river, these quarries would never have existed, as the job of moving the cut stones more than a few hundred meters would have been impossible. But Aswan is not home to the rare gneiss of the statue. In fact, this rock doesn't occur anywhere on the banks of the Nile. In 1999, an international team of scientists came together to see if they could solve the riddle of the location of Khafre's missing quarry and discover how the pharaoh's builders actually brought the stone to Giza.
Many tools actually were found at our excavation.
Are these fairly typical, are they?
Yeah, yes, this is coming from Khafre Quarry, which famous kind of this tool.
For Miriam, finding the statue stone means a journey deep into Egypt's hostile western desert, to the place where team leader Ian Shaw believes they have rediscovered the lost quarry of Khafre. In the 1930s, a British Army patrol had taken a road into the western desert and got lost in a sandstorm. In their confusion, the patrol stumbled upon a mysterious place called Gebel El Aser. Scattered everywhere across the desert, they saw blocks of stone and countless stone tools. Nearly 4,500 years after Khafre's stonemasons had left there for the last time, the patrol had accidentally found his quarry. This was the source of his prized stone. Ian and the team have come to this desolate site many times, and by carefully removing centuries of sand, they have begun to uncover its secrets.
Well, here we are. This is what you've been looking for, the Khafre Quarries.
It's an incredible place. And I recognise the stone. It's very distinctive, isn't it?
This is one of the spoil heaps that forms part of the whole quarry setup. And here I am standing on the spoil heap, which is a mixture of material which has been taken out from over here. And you can see lots of the blocks that they've begun to work that have come out of the ground over there. And down here, lots of lovely big fragments of precisely the kind of stone that the Khafre statue is made from.
But how could these discarded tools and fragments of stone in the desert be definitely linked to Khafre?
This is impressive. It looks like these blocks have been specifically placed here.
What you have to imagine is that originally here between these two big slabs of the Khafre stone, there was a slab with the name of a ruler who sent an expedition here, and that ruler was Khufu.
This is the vital link. Khufu was Khafre's father, proving that the quarry was known and used during that dynasty. Perhaps it was even memories of the wonderful stone brought back by Khufu's expedition that inspired his son to commission his own extraordinary statue. But the Egypt detectives still have questions. Egyptians moved heavy stones by water, but this quarry is 35 miles from the nearest point on the Nile where it could be transferred to a barge for the journey to Giza. So how had they moved it? Miriam calls Dominic to see if his knowledge of Egyptian wall paintings might throw any light on how these engineering problems were solved.
I can think of one particular tomb that might be really helpful, but the thing is that the picture may be really damaged. I've heard that it's not in very good shape, so I don't know how far it'll get us.
Well, I think you should really go and have a look at it.
The problem is that it's up a really steep slope, so I'm not promising anything.
The tomb is at Deir el-Bersha, a necropolis over 100 miles south of Cairo. But Dominic isn't convinced he can even get there. A recent operation on his ankle makes him extremely anxious about his chances of success.
There are two things that I'm worried about. One is that the relief may no longer exist, and the second is that it's up a very, very steep mountainside, which I don't think I'm going to be able to get up.
It was going to be a tough climb, and there was no guarantee that there would be anything to see at the end of it.
Here it is. Things I do for Egyptology.
The tomb was made for an Egyptian governor who immortalized his glorious life on its walls. Old records show that the painting depicted how a huge statue had been moved. Dominic just has to hope that this ancient picture still survives.
It's quite hard to see in here in this dark tomb after the bright light out of the desert, but
At first, it looks as if Dominic is out of luck.
these Coptic crosses don't look like very good news because it might mean that the painting's been vandalized. There's been a rockfall from the ceiling as well, which has left this great huge blank. And here it is. Here it is, after all that. It's badly broken up by the rockfall, but you can see a massive statue being drawn along on a sledge. And it's being lubricated as it moves along by water being poured on it. And it's being pulled by these massed ranks of men, 3 deep, who are pulling on the ropes that are attached to the sled to move it along.
The wall painting suggests that there is no real mystery to moving huge stones. Egyptians simply put them on a sledge and used the brute force of a huge number of laborers to drag them along. It's time to call Miriam.
Hello?
Hey Miriam, it's Dominic.
Oh, Dominic, did you get into the tomb?
Yes, I did, and the relief is in really good shape.
What does it show about the movement of the blocks?
Well, they're put on sledges, wooden sledges, which are drawn along by teams of men on ropes, and to ease the movement of the sledges, the water is poured as a lubricant.
So do you think this is the answer? This is how they were getting the blocks out of the quarry?
Yep, I think that's the answer to how they move the blocks.
So is this the end of the trail for the Egypt detectives? Did Khafre get his stone by simply sending hundreds of men into the desert to drag it back for him?
They look as if they've just been freshly cut these stones down here, don't they?
Back at the quarry, however, the discovery of mysterious stone structures in the sand suggests the Egyptians had in fact been far more ingenious than anyone had imagined.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Egypt detectives Dominic, Montserrat and Miriam Cooke are investigating the mystery of this statue of the Pharaoh Khafre. It was carved from a block of very rare stone that came from a distant desert quarry. Usually the ancient Egyptians relied on barges on the Nile to transport such heavy blocks. But this quarry was deep in the western desert. So how did they move a 3-ton rock across 35 miles of scorching sand to reach the Nile? Dominic has found a tomb painting showing a huge statue being dragged by hundreds of men, suggesting brute force was the answer. If so, there should still be evidence at the quarry of this massive desert army. Miriam asks Ian Shaw if his team know how many people worked here 4,500 years ago.
I'm thinking about how these blocks were moved. And the image that comes to my mind is large numbers of men dragging these sledges with big blocks on top of them. How feasible is that here? Would it have worked?
It's not possible. There weren't large numbers of people at this site.
Ian's evidence comes from his work here amongst the low stone walls of what was once a workers' camp.
Well, we've got the remains here of some kind of oval encampment. So you can see the wall coming around here and then the side of the slope. And the kind of numbers that you're talking about that would be needed to haul one of these great huge sledges along, they're just too many people to have housed in something like this. There just wasn't any kind of large settlement that you'd expect to be housing the kind of workforce that you'd need to pull one of these big sledges.
So something other than sheer force must have been used to move Khafre's stone. There were simply never enough people at the quarry here to do it in the way shown in the painting. The investigation seems to be going nowhere, stuck in the engulfing, smothering desert sand, a problem from which Khafre's enigmatic statue had somehow escaped. The team know the answer must lie in the quarry itself, if they can just put together all the clues. An obvious start would have been to make the blocks as light as possible, and the team's geologist, Tom Heldal, has shown that this is what happened. Instead of moving massive raw blocks, the Egyptians cut them down to a convenient statue size in situ. Sculptors called these blanks.
They were using hammer stones, like this one here. That's made of a slightly harder stone, that they can use for carving the surface or hammering the surface to a smooth, to one plane. And this one is a whole one, but you're also, like this one you can see have been used. It's broken in two and left in the quarry. So in this case you can see this is a asymmetrical block that is quite flat on the bottom, and it's a thin edge, narrow edge here, and it's a bit fatter here. And that is actually fitting the shape of a sitting pharaoh sculpture.
So this was the sort of size block Khafre had moved, but it was still far too large to simply drag. At Aswan, the answer had been water transport. So could that be the answer here? Was there once water in the desert? The archaeologist went back to the data for long-term climate change and made a remarkable discovery. Around 4,500 years ago, when the quarry was in use, North Africa was probably greener and seasonally wetter.
So the evidence that we have here...
And sure enough, team member Elizabeth Bloxham has found evidence that suggests there was once at least some water at the quarry.
Been focusing on this side of the research.
So Elizabeth, why do you think this is a well? Because it looks very similar to a small hut.
So if you look at the ground surface, you can see it's this very dark brown mud with very, very deep cracks here, indicating that it's a well and the water was coming up into these cracks.
And is it the same period as the Khafre quarries?
Yes, it is, because there are similar wells in the quarries, and one of them had an Old Kingdom pouring vessel in the base in a similar crack like this.
How does this particular well inform us about climate change, that it was a wetter environment here?
Simply because the water was so close to the surface, about 3 feet, so it indicates seasonally higher rainfall at the time.
Many other wells have now also come to light at the quarry, suggesting that water was available here 4,500 years ago. But you can't float a barge on underground water.
So we have water here, but we're still 35 miles from the Nile. Is there any river or channel that could have connected the two that might provide some kind of water transport?
Well, we do have the Wadi Tushka, which is just a short distance over there.
Today, the Wadi Tushka is a dry valley, but 4,500 years ago, in the rainy season, it could have filled up with water and provided Egyptian engineers with a connection to the Nile. But there is still a problem. The wadi is some distance from the quarry itself, so the ancient Egyptians had to first get the stone overland to the wadi and then somehow get the blocks onto the water. So could the answer lie in these puzzling structures back at the quarry itself? These wedge-shaped ramps were built from the same stone used in the Pharaoh's statue, but with mysterious tracks at their base. The team are convinced these must hold the final clue.
That the environment was a lot wetter at that time and that water possibly played an important part in the transport of these blocks. But what is this, and how would this have fitted into the equation?
Well, basically we know that this is a type of stone ramp of the time of Khafre, and like most ramps, the basic idea seems to have been taking the big stone blocks that would eventually be statues up to the top here, and our initial assumption was that what they were trying to do was to get them onto some kind of conventional wooden sledge.
But then we excavated further and we realised how high the ramp is. A conventional low-lying sledge would only come up to this height, but we also have these very deep and wide tracks. So it seemed that this was purpose-built for a vehicle that we don't know about in the archaeological record so far.
But purpose-built for what kind of vehicle, do you think?
Well, we know that the task that the Egyptians had was to get the stone from here to the Nile, to the river, and we know that the Khafre statue was found at Giza, and that therefore that was the ultimate destination of the statue blocks, 800 miles up to the north by river.
But they would also want to minimise the amount of times that they moved the block.
So what you're suggesting is a kind of amphibious vehicle?
That's certainly one possibility.
Moving the pharaoh's stone by sledge would have been an almost impossible task. So the archaeologists believe that the ancient Egyptians may have come up with an ingenious engineering solution, an amphibious vehicle. This would only need to be loaded once and could then move the stone across both land and water. This sketch gives us an idea of how this remarkable vehicle might have looked. A simple, sturdy raft made buoyant with inflated animal skins. Underneath the raft were runners that allowed it to be precisely placed in front of the ramp. That's the reason for those mysterious tracks. Then it could be dragged, probably by animals, to the flooded Wadi Tushka, and from there floated down to the Nile. This theory is partly supported by this rare wall engraving that Elizabeth found. It depicts an ancient raft provided with additional buoyancy by animal skins filled with air, which could then bear the weight of these huge stone blocks. But were the archaeologists correct? The Egypt detectives returned to Aswan to put the theory to the test. Could such a craft have solved Khafre's transportation problem? In Aswan, they have commissioned a small-scale version of the craft from team member Adil Kalani. He and his colleagues use only the materials available to the ancient Egyptians, wooden planks, rope, and inflatable goat skins, to create one of these amazing amphibious barges.
The skins around.
To test the theory properly, the model has to be precisely scaled and balanced.
What's the scale of this compared with the loading ramp and the tracks?
About a quarter of the size of the one that would have been used in conjunction with the loading ramps.
So these two pieces of wood here, are these the runners that would have gone into those ruts in front of the ramp?
Yes, exactly. They would fit into those tracks. Quite easy to hold it across.
As final preparations are made, it begins to look doubtful whether this apparently fragile craft will bear the weight of the stones they have prepared, exactly 1/4 of the original full-size load. There's only one way to find out. As the sun sets over the Nile, the craft is loaded, then prepared for launch. It's the first time the idea has been used in 4,500 years. Will it float? The answer is a surprising but triumphant yes. This may only have been a miniature version of a much grander original, but it proves that the principle works. Such a craft could have carried the rare stone from the quarry to the Wadi Tushka and then to the Nile for its final journey to Giza. Only then, after a 700-mile journey across sand and water, could that precious iridescent rock be transformed into the image of Khafre himself, granting immortality in stone to a man the Egyptians believed had been a god on earth. Akhenaten, Egypt's most controversial pharaoh. Over 3,000 years ago, this turbulent king began a revolution, overturning centuries of Egyptian belief. But his great experiment died with him, and in the resulting backlash, his successors tried to erase his name from history. So what drove Akhenaten to risk becoming the most reviled pharaoh in Egyptian history? Was his revolution driven by necessity, greed, or divine inspiration? To solve this mystery, Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat and archaeologist Miriam Cooke journey to Akhenaten's abandoned city and discover an extraordinary project which is, for the first time, letting us look into the mind of Akhenaten, the rebel pharaoh. Akhenaten should have been just another in a long line of pharaohs. But instead, just 5 years into his reign, he suddenly and inexplicably decided to change everything. Banishing the old gods and closing their temples, he announced that one god now ruled Egypt. And as if to draw a line under the past, moved his capital and 50,000 of his subjects to a new city he ordered to be built hundreds of miles from their old homes. But why? What clues remain to one of the greatest Egyptian mysteries must still lie in the ruins of his lost city. So this is where the Egypt detectives decide to begin their search. At the time of Akhenaten's birth, around 1350 BC, Egypt had two ancient capitals: Thebes, the religious center in the south, and Memphis, the political hub some 400 miles to the north. But when Akhenaten came to build his new capital at a site now known as Amarna, he inexplicably placed it as far from these old seats of power as possible on this isolated desert site.
The story of Akhenaten's been told many times, but nobody's ever really explained why he decided to move the capital here to Amarna.
Yeah, and moving an entire capital city, now that would have been a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it would have meant displacing tens of thousands of people, making them leave their homes and what was familiar, and then getting them out here and making them work bloody hard to build a whole new capital city.
Today, only ghosts remain at Amarna. When the pharaoh died, his dream died with him. And just 25 years after it was begun, his city was left to be reclaimed by the desert. But in an empty tomb, high on the cliffside above the city, a clue to what drove Akhenaten can still be found carved on the walls.
Blimey. God, look at this.
This tomb was cut into the living rock at a time when Akhenaten's city still thrived, and his courtier, Ai, for whom it was built, carefully recorded his master's new beliefs on its walls. This is the face of Akhenaten.
Take a look on that wall there.
And above him shines the Aten, or sun disk. This, the pharaoh now proclaimed, was the one and only god. But for most Egyptians, this was unthinkable heresy. For millennia, they had worshipped many gods, usually represented in human or animal form. These gods, they believed, had made Egypt great. Now a new pharaoh had swept them and their priests aside, and had even declared that he was the new high priest, the single connection to the sun god they must all now worship. The courtier Ai, however, had no doubts, and the unique inscriptions on his tomb exalt the new god.
It's the hymn to the Aten, Akhenaten's own statement of religious belief. There's nothing else like it in the whole of Egyptian religious literature.
Can you read some of it?
Yeah, sure. Your radiance fills every land with your beauty. I am your son, born from your rays.
So a kind of manifesto?
Yeah, you could put it that way.
In this hymn to the Aten, Akhenaten set out his new ideology. He told his people that there was now just one all-powerful god, the Aten, to whom he alone could provide access. This was the one simple truth. But was this divine inspiration or Machiavellian cunning? Miriam and Dominic decide to head south to the city where Akhenaten grew up to see if the roots of his conversion can be uncovered there. The journey south from Amarna takes the Egypt detectives away from Akhenaten's radical new vision, back to the old religion of Egypt. At Thebes, the great temple of Karnak was the center of the royal cult of Amun and a focus of the old Egyptian religion, whose history even then stretched back thousands of years. Here the temple walls show another, more surprising side to the young Akhenaten, far removed from the heretic of the history books.
Well, here's Akhenaten, or what's left of him.
But he looks just like a traditional pharaoh. Look, he's smiting the 9 enemies of Egypt. That's a very standard image.
Yeah, and another standard thing is the inscription at the top, which talks about him worshipping Amun.
So what happened?
Well, conventional images like this date from the beginning of Akhenaten's reign, but within the next couple of years, things begin to change completely.
Akhenaten had taken the throne not in that name, but as Amenhotep IV, a name which honored the god Amun worshipped at Karnak. But all was not well between the royal house of Amenhotep and the religious house of Amun. By the time of Akhenaten's accession, the large temples had become as rich and powerful as the pharaoh. Could Akhenaten's sudden conversion to Atenism have as much to do with the politics of this power struggle as with divine inspiration? Dominic has found an archaeologist who thinks it might.
There was a problem between the Amun priesthood and the kingship, with the priests jockeying for ultimate power. And by the time Akhenaten comes to the throne, this has been going on for several generations. And it was obviously something which Akhenaten had decided to grapple with and solve once and for all.
So Akhenaten's religious revelation actually had some very practical benefits for him. In his new religion, he was the only high priest, the only channel of communication with the one and only God. The priests of other gods were now irrelevant and powerless, and where better to assert his power than outside the wealthiest temple of them all, at Karnak.
If you go up there, you might get a better view of it. What can you see?
Well, it looks pretty much like a wasteland from up here, but I can see that there's plenty of buried archaeology here.
Well, that's the remains of the great temple Akhenaten built on this site, the Gempa Aten. It means I have found the Aten, and it's evidence of his religious ideas unfolding.
It was a highly provocative gesture, building the new Aten temple directly outside the ancient house of Amun, and was clearly designed to confront the old religion head-on.
And I can see that we're outside the boundaries of the temple precinct.
Yeah.
So why is he building out here?
Well, that's exactly the point. The temple originally faced that way, so its back was turned on the temple of Amun.
Hold on, I'm just going to come down.
Okay.
So Akhenaten began his campaign against the old faith here at its very heart in Thebes. Yet the temple of Amun still stands, while his temple is just rubble. So what went wrong? Why didn't he finish what he started in Thebes, but instead chose to leave the city forever and move to a lonely desert site hundreds of miles away? The answers may lie in an extraordinary project, which is painstakingly reassembling the evidence left by Akhenaten. Will these fragments help the Egypt detectives explain what turned a once dutiful king into a rebel pharaoh? The Egypt detectives are on a quest to investigate the mystery of ancient Egypt's most controversial pharaoh, Akhenaten. Over 3,000 years ago, this pharaoh suddenly turned his back on the traditional gods of Egypt and moved almost 50,000 of his people to a desolate spot in the middle of the desert. But what drove him there? Piety? Power? Or panic? The answer to this question is now coming to light in an archaeological project that is reconstructing the story in Akhenaten's own words, using records found hidden within the walls of the Karnak temple at Thebes. This gate was constructed over a decade after Akhenaten's death, but at its heart lies a clue to the fate of that pharaoh's dream. The core of this building is made up of unusually small blocks called talatat.
Goodness. Wow.
it is.
So this is the Akhenaten Temple project?
Yes, the results of that, yes.
But these talatat are not just ordinary stones. They had a life before they were used in the gateways of Karnak, as the decorated walls of the great Aten temple, demolished soon after Akhenaten's death. On their side lie clues to the real story of the rebel pharaoh. Professor Don Redford has the job of analyzing this elaborate jigsaw, and Miriam has joined him at the warehouse where the blocks are stored.
What are talatat?
That's the term we apply to a standard-sized block 52 centimeters long by 26 wide. About 100 pounds, which a single person could carry, a man, a worker.
How do they compare to a normal building block?
Well, the standard-sized block in Egyptian masonry is much larger, something about in the order of this, weighing 2 to 2.5 tons usually, so considerably heavier and more difficult to move than a talatat.
Don Redford believes that the size of these blocks is significant. Akhenaten was in a hurry to build his temple, and these smaller blocks meant his builders could work fast.
Certainly they speeded up the work, and Akhenaten seems to have wanted that. The workers were being forced to work so quickly that design and layout sometimes was faulty, and it seems rather sloppy work.
Do you get the sense of an impulsive character behind this building technique?
I do think there was an impulsiveness in his personality. He was bound to worship the sun god, to promote that single god, and he was going to do so by eliminating all other allusions to mythology in Egypt, which of course would entail referring to other deities. This was anathema to him. He was going to forbid it, and he was moving in stages towards a very purified, almost puritanical type of religion devoted to a single god.
Akhenaten was clearly in a hurry to push through his revolution. Rushing to replace the old gods, rushing to begin his new order. But was this through religious fervor or fear? This is Pylon 10, a huge gate that once guarded the Karnak temple. Its core is still piled high with talatat, and at the very top, one sandstone block holds another enigmatic clue. A message from Akhenaten to his people, a message they may not have wanted to hear.
Well, here it is. At last, the inscription.
Can you translate it?
Yes, I think I can.
This is the most important column, which reads, "They have stopped, one after the other, whether of precious gems or gold or silver, I presume." He's speaking of the cult images of the gods.
That phrase, "the gods have stopped," that's a rather strange statement. What exactly is he saying there, then? The gods have stopped. What does that mean?
That's very odd, actually. It's very strange. The verb he uses to cease movement or to stop is what elsewhere in Egyptian texts is used of what the sun never does. The sun keeps going around and around without ceasing. But here he's saying that other manifestations of the supernatural have ceased. So this is obviously, it seems to me, one of these speeches that were made periodically by the kings of Egypt to their court and for public dissemination on walls and this sort of thing. And he is making here an announcement.
So what impact would this have had?
It must have been a bombshell.
Akhenaten was attempting to end the centuries-old way of life at a single stroke. In one simple pronouncement, he had declared that the old gods of Egypt were dead, and only his god, the sun disk, lived on, ceaselessly circling the heavens. But Don Redford believes that this message was not what the people of Thebes wanted to hear, and that their hostile response may have driven Akhenaten to found his new desert city. To show Miriam evidence of this opposition, Don takes her to the west side of the Nile, where the Egyptians traditionally buried their dead.
Well, here we are, tomb number 188, the tomb of Paranefer of the Theban necropolis, and they're already at work. Shall we give them a hand clearing the stones?
Why not?
Right.
This tomb belonged to one of Akhenaten's loyal servants, and its walls still bear witness to the fervent opposition which his revolution had unleashed.
Wow, it's really damaged, isn't it?
Oh, yes. About 80 years ago, a family lived here, and their cooking fires covered the ceiling with soot.
Pharaoh Khafre's tomb was cut over 3,000 years ago, and on its walls are recorded the extraordinary changes that he witnessed in his lifetime, from Akhenaten's childhood to the cultural revolution of his reign.
And here is the man himself, Pharaoh Khafre, standing before his king, facing his king, and gesticulating with his hand to his mouth, which is a sign of deference before the monarch. You don't want to speak or breathe directly on him. Here is what I'm talking about.
So these are clearly traditional gods, but I can see the ardent disk right here.
That's right. This represents a major change. And here you see, violently hammered away, the rock where the figure of Akhenaten was originally placed.
To Egyptians, destroying a king's image destroyed his place in the afterlife, a demonstration of almost fanatical hatred for the man they had once called Pharaoh. But why?
And in the 4 columns down here, there were invocations to other gods. Well, I think there is something of an answer in this very tomb, and I'll show you. As for the servant who is not diligent concerning the divine offerings of the sun disk, he gives himself into your power.
So this is giving us an idea of the political situation in Thebes at the time.
There is a veiled threat. The servant who is not diligent, who is lax about the new program that the king is instituting, is going to give himself into the power of God, and that's for ill. Well, I can show you that if we go down the wall over here.
Akhenaten intended to convert his people by threats, not faith.
Here is Pharaoh Khafre, seated on a chair with his servants and secretaries in front of him.
But this revolution affected more than just his people's beliefs. It was destroying their livelihoods.
But the measuring for the sun disk is in superabundance. In fact, the incomes, the endowments are being diverted from all the other gods' temples into the new temple of the sun disk. What he was doing was really throwing people out of work in all the other temples, and it was building up a considerable amount of resentment against him.
Ordinary people faced financial disaster as their employers, the temples, were closed down. Akhenaten now had the temple's money, but that was also his people's income.
The Egyptian temples were the powerhouses of the Egyptian economy. So if someone like Akhenaten comes along and closes down all the temples and takes over their assets, then this is making quite a considerable economic statement, and it is economic suicide.
In breaking the power of the temples, the pharaoh was bankrupting his people, and it seems neither the priests nor the thousands of people they employed were prepared to accept this lying down. For all his power, Akhenaten couldn't change Thebes fast enough. So he simply left the problem behind. He abandoned the old city with all its reminders of the old religion, abandoned his own temple outside Karnak, and headed off to the desert site of Amarna, where a vision told him to found a new capital. He was running from his critics.
He was receiving criticism. It was not veiled criticism. These were evil words, as he characterizes them. He simply cut and ran and created this new sort of dream city of his in the waste of the desert, where he could be his own man, put down his own roots, and he didn't have to deal with anyone.
At Amarna, there is evidence to support this idea. Akhenaten's own words, inscribed on tablets erected on the city boundaries, read like the words of a frightened man.
It was worse than those things heard by any kings who had ever assumed the white crown.
So Akhenaten hadn't moved his capital to Amarna purely from choice. He had begun his revolution at Thebes, but in Thebes it had started to go wrong. Now he was afraid, and probably with good reason.
I think one can interpret this as indicating that there was some opposition to Akhenaten's plans. which could even have manifested themselves in an assassination attempt at the king.
An assassination attempt would have been the ultimate challenge to Akhenaten's power base, leaving him no option but to leave Thebes and head into the desert to create his new city. This is a new and startling portrait of a unique pharaoh. A man whose impetuous desire to establish ultimate power nearly wrecked his country's economy and left him haunted and hunted. King of a dreamlike desert city that would prove little more than a mirage. Miriam is convinced by this practical explanation, but Dominic still sees in Akhenaten's work the hand of a man divinely inspired.
Well, I prefer the idea of Akhenaten as a practical politician. He's a man driven by circumstances rather than being a grand thinker. It's tactics. He's not strong enough to implement the changes he wants to here at Thebes, so he moves to Amarna.
I think we've just got completely opposing views. That's not the Akhenaten I know.
But will we ever know the real Akhenaten, Dominic?
To look into the mind of Akhenaten is still to look into an enigma. Shortly after his death, his own heirs began a full and terrible backlash against his revolution. His temples were destroyed, his image removed from every building, document, and painting that could be found. He became to the Egyptians a non-person, a man and a time they pretended had simply never happened. Only now is his story re-emerging from the sands of Amarna, a lost pharaoh for a lost city, a man whose vision, inspired by avarice, power, and panic, went too far and too fast for his people to follow.